All righty, well, thank you so much for staying this late. It's 6:30. I know that we're running a little late now, but it's great to see you out here. I think maybe having the champagne helped, and also this gorgeous group of ladies here. This is a particularly, this is a particularly appropriate time to be having this discussion in her shoes and talking about conservative women and feminism, because we are in the 100th year of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So that was June 4th, 1919. It was ratified in 1920. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And March 1st, today, kicks off National Women's Month, which was launched, I guess, like 80 years ago to commemorate and honor the vital role that women play in our country's history and the tremendous policy impact they've made, and also in deciding on who sits in the Congress and the White House. So this is a really appropriate time to have this discussion. But since it's in her shoes, I just want to kick it off by saying, clearly, feminism is not one size fits all. And our gender is only part of who we are and what drives our opinion. It's our experience and our point of view and our guiding principles, really. So that age-old question of, what do women want, I think is, all over now with the women's movement and the Year of the Woman. So I wanted to ask these younger women that are in the trenches in politics, how do you feel? Do you feel as a conservative woman you are a feminist? And if you can describe how you feel and what's your definition of a feminist. But before I just realized I forgot to introduce our lovely panelist here. To my left, the first is Inez Stepman. She is a senior policy analyst for the Independent Women's Forum. She's worked in education policy for 7 years, and prior to joining IWF was the Director of Education and Workforce Development at ALEC. Stepman's research focuses on educational freedom, school choice, and the cultural impact of empowering parents with control over their children's educations. She's the author of numerous policy papers, including the annually compiled report card on American education. She's a senior contributor to The Federalist, where she writes on subjects ranging from feminism to fashion, and the Thursday editor of Bright, a woman's daily newspaper. She's a proud first-generation American and holds a BA in philosophy from the University of California, San Diego, and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And I've got Tiana Lowe here. She's a commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. She's a DC-based political commentator for the Washington Examiner, the co-host of the Political Pregame podcast. Her work previously has been published in Politico magazine and The Spectator in London. She has written for National Review as an editorial intern and founded the USC Economics Review, graduated from USC with a BS in mathematics and economics, and her work has been featured on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, promoted in the New York Times, the New York Post, the New York Daily News, the Hollywood Reporter, and many other national outlets. And finally, Holly Turner is a grassroots advocate, is the co-founder of Stampede Consulting, a nationwide grassroots firm specializing in person-to-person communications for conservative causes and candidates. With a workforce of military veterans, active duty spouses, and conservative activists, Holly and her team mobilize voters across the country on important issues. She recently completed a year in the Trump administration as assistant administrator at the Small Business Administration, where her focus was on identifying and removing barriers to success for small business. Amen. A Texan for life, Holly currently resides in Washington, D.C. with her family, her husband, Chris, and 3 little boys. Yeah. So welcome. And so I will pose the question again. Do you consider yourself a feminist as a conservative woman, and can you be one?
So I guess I'll kick it off with the negative, because that's, I'm Eastern European, I got to do that. My answer is no. I don't think you can be both a conservative and a feminist, and certainly I think most of the panel will probably agree that the modern definition of feminism, or at least what's thrown around as feminism, is completely incompatible with conservatism. But I actually want to make the argument that there's a deeper incompatibility between the feminist movement going all the way back to the 1940s, to Simone de Beauvoir. I think the fundamental project really comes down to two things, right? One, to separate sex from gender, and then from that to say that there should not be any societal consequences of the differences between men and women, that we should ignore as a society any of those differences. And then the second part of that is that those differences are not innate, but due to some kind of social construct, the social construct theory. And I think those two premises that go all the way back to the 1940s, they aren't new, they didn't come around in the 1970s, they didn't come around in the last 3 years, they go all the way back to Beauvoir, they go all the way back to Betty Friedan in America. I think those two premises are one, false, and two, sets up an inevitable contradiction between the feminist movement and the choices of actual women when they are free to choose. And I think you see that so frequently today, right? We see that women, when given the choice, frequently when they have children, they choose to work part-time. And in fact, survey after survey shows that women would prefer to work part-time or not at all when they have young children. That's at odds with the lean-in feminist message, right? And that produces the pay gap that, so bothers the left. And even in sort of the personal, we see this constant messaging around toxic masculinity, when in fact, there's an observational case to be made that women like a little toxic masculinity in their men. That they don't really prefer the Gillette man, right, to a guy with a little more toxic masculinity in his bearing. And as long as feminism, those fundamental premises of feminism, the separation between sex and gender, and the fact that our biological sex should have little to no impact on the way that society is constructed or programs are constructed or anything else, and the idea that that the differences between us are a social construct, I think those are an inevitable conflict with the first principles of conservatism. That doesn't mean that women don't have natural rights as guaranteed by the Declaration and the Constitution. That's not at all, obviously not at all the argument that I'm making, but I do think feminism as an ideology, as an academic movement that then became a social movement with multiple waves, does have some premises that are at heart contradictory to conservatives.
So it sounds as if what you think has occurred, the left has defined feminism in a way that we as conservative women can't buy into it all. It didn't used to be that way. Going back to the 19th Amendment, and when women have felt more solidarity on getting the right to vote or empowering themselves to make their own decisions. But it does seem like today, contemporary feminism has parts of it that is not, as you were saying, compatible with conservative women. How do you feel about it, Tiana?
So to the point about outcomes versus freedom, I obviously do not subscribe to third wave feminism, but to me, feminism, from the dictionary definition perspective, is something that I fully embrace for the same reason I embrace conservatism. It's not about the outcome, it's about the freedom of the opportunity. And just like the American dream is a chance, it is not a promise of success. I think that feminism is the chance and the opportunity to have, equal admissions, and you have the right to work and do and be and achieve what you want. I think that where the left has hijacked the narrative with regards to feminism is that it's supposed to be outcome oriented. It's supposed to be this teleological equalizer where if you don't have perfect gender parity in a specific field, then that field is a failure. That field is not sufficiently woke. When obviously we know that's not true. I agree that men and women have, specifically when it comes to emotional and behavioral aspects, they're on an average, men and women are have different skills. Men tend to score better when it comes to spatial skills and spatial awareness. Women are a little bit better when it comes to some emotional negotiation. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that on the statistical average, men and women differ. That being said, I think that feminism, not as an academic tool, not in the ivory towers of universities, but as a general guiding principle, in the same way that all groups that previously lacked the same rights that, our founding fathers had, the same way that they are able to use a movement, it's to bring everyone up to the top line, not equalize people by pushing them down. It's not a sort of conservative feminism, it's just humanism. Mm-hmm. It is not about diminishing the rights of men. It's not about denigrating men. It's not about devaluing the value of, there's so many times in which toxic masculinity is no longer describing Harvey Weinstein or predatory behavior, but gentle, chivalry, things that we've come to respect. We want men to be gentlemen, and we want women to be strong ladies. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that the proper feminism, and I think it's time for us to take the narrative back, isn't incompatible or isn't even different from conservatism. It is one and the same. It is the equality of opportunity. It is the right for us to come in a room and prove our worth. No one should hand us anything. And I think that women need to be willing to take more risks. And I think that a lot of the feminist narrative has been, in a strange way, even the most liberal third wave feminism has encouraged women not to take risks. It has not told them to be okay with, I was a math major. I got C's for the first time in my life in college. And I had to become okay with it. And I realized that's something that wasn't necessarily instilled in me when I was younger, not intentionally. But I think that women are told to be afraid of failure. And I think that these smaller cultural cues, I think these are things that are worth paying attention to. And I don't think that's incompatible with understanding that the only thing that fundamentally matters is equality of opportunity and a culture that builds people up, not knocks them down. Doesn't knock down men, doesn't knock down women, and certainly tries to elevate everyone.
Thank you. And Holly, you're out and about with your business and mother of the 3 boys. So how do you consider yourself a feminist?
Yeah, there was a time that I definitely did, and I think growing up in a very traditional household with my parents filling their traditional gender roles, I didn't want to be a stay-at-home mom, and so I, embarked on this journey to go to law school, and I felt like a feminist, right? Like I felt like I was something special and kind of doing something different, only because it was different from the way I was raised and what was modeled for me and my family. But as I get out into the real world and see that there are lots of women like me that are doing this. It's not, it's what you're saying, it's just being human, right? And basic human opportunity and basic human rights. And I think, if we step back and our role is, as conservatives, is a couple of things. It's to not judge. And if somebody wants to claim that title and they're a conservative, I'm cool with that. I'm not gonna say, you can't use that word because of this movement means this or that, like they've done. They're definitely ostracizing women from the movement. But I think the bigger thing is looking at why is this an issue? And it's really because the left is using this. They have claimed this movement as their own, and it is to, it's a part of their identity politics strategy. They thrive on creating a victim mentality in their base, and when they're telling women that they are victims, and women are buying into it, and that is feeding right into their political strategy. And we saw that in the last election with the number of women that are voting with Democrats now. So I think stepping back and kind of understanding what's really happening and why is it important, and it's really about the future. It's not about equal pay and things like that. It's really about a power struggle that's happening between 2 very different ideologies.
So clearly what I'm hearing, we have a problem with the definition, which you said they've hijacked. And we also have a problem in there are not enough women out there that are elected officials, that are great candidates, that are winning elections, that we can have the alternate view of women's empowerment, as you said, humanism. We really want to have it so that whether you're a man or a woman, you have the freedom to define your life and reach your potential in any way that you want to without being restrained by preconceived notions. So how I'd love to open it up to the three of you on how do you think we should address that as a party, really? The definition and getting more women to identify with our form of humanism or empowerment.
Well, first of all, I think we're always going to be running upstream, right? Because during the Reagan Revolution, we as conservatives really let the left take over virtually every cultural institution. And that's from K-12 education and higher ed to, more relevant to this conversation, almost all women's media is not just left, but like super left, and not just on quote unquote women's issues, reproductive issues, any of that. But I mean, you can't open Vogue without reading about Trump's immigration policy, right? Conservatives have ignored those cultural, the cultural milieu and the institutions that create the cultural milieu for way, way too long. And actually, so Glenn Reynolds, he goes online as Incompatibility, right? He had, I think, a great line in a column. This was already in 2010 or something like that, so he was way ahead of the curve on this. He said, if just one conservative billionaire stopped funding a think tank and bought Marie Claire, we might have a lot better shot, culturally speaking. And I like to call this actually the glamour gap, right? Which is that no matter how radical, and we definitely saw this with the leaders of the women's movement, and then as Ben Shapiro likes to call them, the fresh faces of the Democratic Party, every one of them has a Vogue spread, has glamorous photos, very fawning interviews in women's media, and they're held up as an example. They don't actually represent the majority of women in this country. Women split up about a third. A third consider themselves conservative, a third consider themselves moderate of some type, and a third consider themselves liberal. And then you have this very, very left chunk of liberal that is actually represented as, sort of the glamorous ideal that's held up in women's magazines and women's media. So I do think that we need to pay more attention to culture, and actually I think that would go a long way towards starting to open women up culturally to the conservative messaging that's being put out. But I do want to throw out one more bomb, I guess, into this conversation, which is we are constantly talking about the gap, right? The women gap, like does the GOP have a woman problem because it's about 60-40 now, right? We're constantly kind of rehashing this. We had this panel at CPAC. We have, post-election autopsies, right, on this over and over and over again. Nobody in the media is talking about whether or not the Democratic Party has a man gap. And they do. There's a reason it's 60-40. It's getting close to 60-40 on the other side. And I think the reasons for that are pretty clear. I think the Democratic Party and the left are becoming more and more hostile to men. But, look, 2016 should teach us something. Sometimes it's better to double down on your base and energize your base than it is to try to seek out new constituencies. And frankly, I think there are probably a lot of men, moderate men out there in America who are deeply uncomfortable with the direction that the left is going on their messaging on masculinity and being a man. I think there are a lot of men out there who are uncomfortable with that. So I'm all about, fine with talking about how we message to women, but maybe we should also be talking about, maybe there should be a corresponding panel with, although I actually prefer like Manhattans and old fashions, but maybe we should have a corresponding panel, with old fashions talking about, okay, how do we reach out to men who now feel alienated from the Democratic Party?
I mean, my hope is that this would be whiskey with women, but cosmos will suffice. So I think that, yes, you're correct that the Democratic Party has a man problem, and that much is obviously made true when men aren't vilified for criminal behavior, for violent behavior, but they are vilified for protective behavior that is the result of 2,000 years of civilization and evolution. But with regards to the Republican Party's woman problem, which I think obviously exists, I think it is less that feminism has a conservatism problem and more the reverse, in the sense that, conservatives, you were talking about messaging. What is conservative messaging right now? Why did Trump beat 16 other of the top Republicans in one of the most talented primary fields? He provided tangibles, and I personally disagreed with those tangibles. I wasn't a fan of a wall. I wasn't a fan of Muslim bans. But that resonated with people because he offered something tangible. You know, tax cuts and Democrats suck and socialism sucks only works when you actually have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez bringing up Green New Deals and threatening to put them to a vote. Conservatives have lost the war in messaging. When we talk about healthcare, you know, Republicans promised for, 8 years that they were gonna repeal and replace Obamacare? All right, they had the Senate, the House, and the White House for 2 years. What happened? Nothing. We got the repeal of the individual mandate. Of course, it makes sense that we're losing younger generations overwhelmingly to the left because conservatives have failed at the messaging war. Especially whenever I discuss Medicare for all with people, so many people don't understand that we are 4.4% of the world's population, yet we produce 44% of the world's medical research and development. The next closest country to us is China, which is 20% of the world's population. The free markets work not only in sustaining our quality of life, but growing it. And the reason why I bring up this deeply economic and policy-minded argument, and not to refute the idea that we did lose the cultural wars, because I think that's true. Conservatives don't spend enough time focusing on art. You know, I think there's this almost reactionary hostility to Hollywood, which makes sense because Hollywood that's where I'm from. It's a gross town. But all forms of art, you know, music, cinema, video games, even I think there's a reason why now conservatives are thriving in the world of podcasting, while conservatives are thriving in YouTube, you know? But what really the Republican Party has failed to do is show that capitalism hasn't elevated the straight white man. Capitalism has unshackled women from domestic servitude. If you think, a century ago, American households spent a quarter of the day cooking. We now spend 1 hour. If you look at every other term of what it requires to maintain a household, keep it alive, everything has been elevated by capitalism. If you look at maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, every single element of women's lives has been improved by capitalism. And yet, women are flocking towards democratic socialists of America. And I believe as much as we have lost the war of cultural messaging, we have lost the war of policy messaging. We have failed to explain that capitalism is the only way to free yourself from the patriarchy. You know, biology is not very favorable to women. Women historically are the gatekeepers of sex. Women lack physical abilities, and in the absence of controlled civilization and in the absence of protection of private property, we are the ones who become victims. In a free society, in a moral society, in a just society, in a capitalist society, in one with law and order and social fabric, we are the victors. We set the terms. We are equals. And it doesn't matter if there's perfect gender parity in each room. The point is that in a capitalist society, in a conservative society, we have the opportunity to go seek out the opportunities that we want. And we can achieve what we want. And you know, like you, I'm also Eastern European. I had 3 of my 4 grandparents fled from Eastern European communist countries to come here. And when the men described their lives, sure, it was bad. When the women described their lives, it was slavery. And I think that that is the messaging war that we have lost. Just as important as pointing out, the Sex and the City lifestyle, I say as I sip on my Cosmo, isn't necessarily going to bring you fulfillment, or isn't going to bring the majority of women fulfillment. As much as we've lost that war, we've lost the fundamental one of the greatest thing to happen in modern civilization are free markets and the protection of private property. And not for the straight white man, but for everyone who was originally subjugated by the upper echelons of society.
So an interesting question then is, you know, we have lost the messaging war, especially towards women. So does it make sense? We talked about this earlier. We don't want to pander to women, right? It's not authentic, and they see right through that, and that is a failure. So how do we help women see through the kind of the feminist lie and the agenda that they have? And one of the things I've talked with a couple of attendees about is how disingenuous it is for the feminist movement to focus on things that, maybe they seem important when it's in an isolated bubble, and it's women's pay and paid time off after you have a child. But when you compare that to what's happening in some countries, Middle Eastern countries, how women are treated, they really are still slaves there. What's happening in China with the selective abortions based on gender. So could we be, and it's hard when you're running a campaign, you need to keep your message kind of tight, but I think that may be something that we could do a better job of, focusing on what the real inequality that's happening and the real abuse that women are suffering across the globe, to maybe shine a light on what's happening here. And just, when you compare them side by side, it really pales in comparison to what other women are. And we don't hear anything from the feminist movement about what's happening across the globe at all. They do not talk about it because they're afraid they're going to offend someone, and because it's not their real agenda. Their real agenda is gaining control of the United States political system.
If I could just jump in for one little point, I absolutely agree. We do not talk about actual subjugation of women. We do not talk about the movement that's going on right now in Iran. We don't talk about any of this stuff, and certainly the feminist left it's just radio silence for the most part. But I think there's an interesting statistic here, which is the freer we become and the wealthier we become through capitalism, which I completely agree with. It turns out the more men and women diverge, and the more we make different choices. In fact, some of the countries with the smallest wage gaps, for example, are places like Rwanda and Somalia, because people are so poor that everyone has to work from dawn to dusk. And actually, it is a product of our wealth and wealth acquired through capitalism. That we are now free to choose, right? We talk about this. This is an incredible privilege that no other women in history have ever had, the freedom to choose not to work, right? And that's not the reality for everybody in America, but the fact that we're even having this cultural conversation about whether women, when they have kids, they want, do they want to stay home? Do they want to work part-time? Do they want to work full-time? This is an incredible privilege brought to us by capitalism, by freedom. And it turns out when given those freedoms, women and men diverge even more in what their dreams are, what they go for, what they go for with those opportunities, right? What those end dreams are for men and women diverges even more when women are actually given, and everybody, frankly, is given the wealth and opportunity and freedom to choose what they actually want to do with their lives.
Well, thank you. I feel like I want to have you all on television constantly, because the way you described the benefits of capitalism, the Western women are so much better off than most of third world countries, where they are really resigned to domestic work or worse. So with that, I'd love to just continue this, but I thought maybe we should open up for some questions. Okay.
Joe.
You had that question in the hopper.
Just yell.
Okay.
So a couple of things. Number one, Tiana, I have to correct you. China, although they produce the second number, they steal most of that.
Correct. IP theft.
We'll talk about that next week. So obviously, I agree. I think most people in the room would agree ardently with you in terms of the idea of free market opportunity and how that empowers the individual. But what would you say, one of the big things that I'm sure you as younger women would say about your contemporaries who are liberal is the perception of conservatism as something that restricts women's rights, things like reproductive health. Mm-hmm. What would you say about a Republican Party that still allows people like Roy Moore to prospectively win the primary? How would you articulate what you are saying on the stage today to a friendly audience, to a more negative audience in that regard?
So this is one where I think conservatism at its core and based on its principles has become so utterly divorced from the Republican Party. So when the whole Brett Kavanaugh hearings began, I set the same standard in terms of judging Brett Kavanaugh that I set for everyone else, which is in the court of public opinion, especially for a lifetime appointee, the preponderance of evidence. And I cried listening both to Christine Blasey Ford's testimony and Brett Kavanaugh's. because I felt both of their pain, but there was no evidence. Ultimately, every single witness who Christine Blasey Ford named said they had no recollection of the party in question ever happening. And ultimately, that does not satisfy the preponderance of the evidence. So in my mind, Kavanaugh was not proven guilty, and that meant that what effectively amounted to a lifetime trial, he was proven innocent. And that made sense that the Senate, in their role to advise and consent, should vote affirmatively for him. With Roy Moore, the initial Washington Post story that broke included not only multiple victims, but multiple people contemporaneously corroborating their allegations. And the hesitance of the Republican Party over one Senate seat, that they would be okay with someone credibly accused of attempted rape, of attempted molestation of minors, that was so abhorrent. And the Democratic Party isn't any better. It's just that they're better at the messaging. You see, if you want to compare, if you want to understand how bad the Democratic Party is at this and how much they do manipulate sexual assault victims, look no further than Dianne Feinstein's office. Who leaked the Christine Blasey Ford letter? Wasn't a Republican. It was sent to a California representative who was Democratic, who then sent it to Dianne Feinstein. She became a pawn. She never wanted to become a public figure. And now we see it again in Virginia. We see Justin Fairfax, again, credibly accused by two liberal women, one with contemporaneous corroboration. So I think it's one of those things where the Me Too movement has been extremely important because it is apolitical, because there is filth that has infiltrated our society, and we must reckon with it. And no, the answer isn't to absolve with due process. The answer isn't to throw out evidentiary standards. The answer is to be more cognizant and more aware that people have relied on their social power to maintain silence. And that's one where the Women's March and the Me Too movement have given the right wing in America one of the greatest opportunities to bring women back into our party. And only to show that, sure, both parties are garbage when it comes to the specific issue of believing, not even believing, but trusting and verifying and taking women seriously, and men seriously for that matter, when they make allegations, investigating and having a consistent standard of evidence that isn't based on political bias. And what the right can do is what every political movement has done in human history, and that is be better. And don't be the party that politicizes something as abhorrent and as terrifyingly bipartisan as sexual violence. This is a moment, and we can capitalize on it. And if we don't, I think that we will look back with not only regret from a pragmatic perspective, but it will be a moral failure.
Thanks.
So, I totally agree with you that this is to some extent an opportunity for conservatives, this Me Too moment. I think that we're overlooking, though, how, and I want to leave Roy Moore to the side because I agree with you. I think that his accusers were credible, and I think that's largely why he lost. It was because Republicans didn't come out, even in a red state, to vote for somebody who had been credibly accused of, pursuing minors, and there were a whole list of these accusations. Some of them shaded into sexual assault. Some of them were just creepy. But I think we're forgetting also that, this whole Me Too movement, women have husbands, they have sons, they have boyfriends, they have brothers, they have fathers. They do not want to see the standard of mere accusation, and they don't want to see the politicization. I think you put your finger on the exact issue that this Me Too movement, which started out rooting out real, criminal predators like Harvey Weinstein, has devolved into a complete political issue where we've expanded the definition of consent and what constitutes consent. It's basically like, maze now for in terms of what constitutes consent and how explicit it has to be, and to the point where we're going to be all signing the contracts. But even that is not going to be good enough because you don't know if somebody really willingly, hit the button. There's actually a consent app now, so you can hit the button, but then it backs up the question, right? Did she fully willingly, with her whole heart, hit the green button on the phone? Because we don't really know that. I mean, these kinds of expansion of consent and this whole issue has really, I think, has fired up conservative women. I mean, don't forget that if we had any bright spots in the midterms in 2018, it was largely because Republican conservative women got so upset about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and they imagined their sons and their brothers and their fathers in that position trying to defend against heinous accusations but had absolutely no evidence. I mean, what was he supposed to do, right, with that kind of accusation? That Republican women enthusiasm jumped 12 points, and without that, we would have seen a lot bigger wipeout, I think, than we did. So I do think that there's a lot of room for the Republican Party to push back against the politicization of this sexual assault issue, of the Title IX issue. I think these are issues that we should seize upon, not only because I think they are political winners, but also because they're right. It's right to defend due process. It's right to defend, to defend men and to defend the innocent, because although these crimes are heinous, we have to know who's actually innocent and who's guilty.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right here.
I agree that I feel the conservative women aren't doing as much as they can to focus on the benefits of capitalism. I was following the Women's March the past 2 years, and 2 years ago it was coming out about the anti-Semitism, and it just kept being swept under the rug. And then finally the DNC denounces their whole march. And I agree too. I also was following women's activists in other parts of the world. So Masih Alinejad, who does the White Wednesday, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who speaks up against FGM, Azra Humani, who also talks about Islamic extremism. So I guess, like, even at CPAC or conservative conferences, like, are we going to start including these women to start talking about their experiences in their countries, because they're backing conservatives even though they're liberal, but on these issues, they are standing with conservative women. And I feel in order, because the Women's March and the women's activists on the left don't touch FGM, they don't touch the mandatory hijab, and a lot of American women don't know these issues that are actually existing in our own country as well. So do you see that, like, in terms of writing about it or talking about it at upcoming conferences? Because I think for this 2020 election to start really highlighting these types of.
If I may touch on this just quickly. So there was a pretty landmark ruling, I want to say it was in Minnesota or Michigan, that essentially attempted to nullify the federal law that bans FGM using the Commerce Clause, although in the case involved mothers, so women were bringing their daughters across state lines to engage in the commercial practice of FGM, which to me, I'm no lawyer, so Inez can correct me, but that seems like clearly it is covered by the Commerce Clause and that federal law should cover it. But no, you're absolutely correct, and even you're seeing in Western Europe, there is a problem, with the rapid waves of migration, and I think with problems of assimilation of people from predominantly Muslim and more extreme Muslim countries coming into societies that aren't necessarily welcoming of them. If you go to a place like America, I think tends to embrace their immigrants, and that's why I think the last 2 years have been scary for a lot of us who are very pro-immigration. A lot of these countries, sort of, especially in Paris, you have the banlieues where people only speak one language and there is no integration, and the children of immigrants don't necessarily go to the same public schools that the native French children go to, and that causes a lot of cultural dissonance. But you are seeing FGM rates spike markedly. Now in the UK, some sex education programs, on top of including the regular left-wing rhetoric on consent, are also now talking about FGM. And this is one where I think it is important for conservative women to reclaim the language of liberty with regards to feminism. Consent is important, especially if you take something like FGM, where in the same way that we say, should children as young as 8 start taking puberty blockers if they have gender dysphoria disorder, when statistically speaking, the overwhelming majority will desist and identify as trans and gay or lesbian, we should also be talking about FGM. We don't want to We should not be allowing parents to mutilate their children with the sole purpose, especially with FGM in particular, about depriving women of their own bodily autonomy and the right to feel sexual pleasure. So I do think that that should be something that we should be more vocal about, but a part of that is accepting that the central tenet of conservatism is liberty and a supportive and elevating social fabric. And that's one that I hope, I mean, I cannot speak on behalf of CPAC, but I think that someone like Iron Hersey Ollie, who I have idolized since I was a child, she would be someone who could be a hero here, absolutely.
It's very exciting because I'm hearing some ideas that could be really unifying for women, whether they're liberal or conservative. When you're talking about economic empowerment and capitalism and just the plight of women that are in situations where they're being physically harmed, either in this country or abroad. And I was going to ask Holly, you know, I feel like we have another opportunity with the live birth abortion issue now that we've just got a few more minutes. You know, do you see an opportunity there to capture more women, whether they are Democrat or Republican, on that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, for so long, being pro-life has been a dirty word, and you know, the Elle and Marie Claire have made it a terrible label to have. But we've seen after, you know, these 6 weeks of Ralph Northam, and then all of the different bills that are happening on along the East Coast, and then the Senate failing to protect infants that are born alive after abortion. We saw across the nation support for people who self-identify as pro-life. It jumped like 11 or 12 points. So, you know, and credit to Senator McConnell for allowing that to go to the floor and to Senator Sass, because it's forcing the left to say where they stand on the issues that is going to alienate a lot of people that may have voted Democrat just this past year. So it's opened up the conversation, and I think especially on the abortion issue, a lot, you know, we've done surveys over time, and people just don't want to think about it, right? They're like, look, pro-choice, it's hard. I can't imagine if I were in that position, or my daughter or something like that. But I mean, the Democrats they've pulled back the kimono, and now we see what it's really about. And people are, I think they're horrified by it, and I think it's the best thing that can happen for the pro-life movement is for that kind of exposure to have happened. So anyway, we'll see what happens, but we appreciate you all being here.
Yes.
And
certainly with 3 women like you talking as articulately as you do, we'll certainly get more people coming over to our definition of feminism and voting our way. So thank you. With that said,
thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists.